Well, let me say a little bit about what I mean by the politics of representation, because I'm going to give you two examples of things that come from my work on Eritrean activities online. And what I think is interesting to think about is the way in which cyberspace and the internet offered the possibility for ordinary people to contest sort of mainstream or official representations. And so what I'm looking at is how people are representing their nation and contesting with the state in particular about representations of that, and also how they're representing their culture and contesting among each other ideas about what it means to be Eritrean, and I look at that through two examples that I'm going to talk about. One is an online memorial, an online war memorial that they created, and the other is images and texts and debates posted about the capital city, Asmara. So I will see, I'm always bad at like remembering to advance the slides while talking. I can't, I thought I was a good multitasker, but apparently not. But, so, I mean, one of the things that I'm interested in is thinking about the characteristics of digital media and the ambiguities of spatialities and temporalities and audience and so on that the internet brings up. And I think these examples might help us think through some of those things. One thing I want to mention is that Eritreans in diaspora were early adopters of computer-mediated communications. They started in the early 1990s, before the World Wide Web, creating some early email lists and subscription, things like that, for discussing Eritrean politics among themselves and trying to participate in the nation building of their new nation. And some of the websites that were, well, the earliest website, Dahai, that started even before the World Wide Web, that continues to exist today. It's still active today, although it's become largely sort of a pro-government website, while newer websites that were established around 2000 and 2001 are more sites of civil society and independent perspectives and dissidents. But some of these websites are really, in a sense, we have to think of them as institutions. They have such a presence and a permanence that have shaped and contributed to this transnational field of Eritrean politics that we really cannot talk about Eritrean politics without taking the diaspora and the online political sphere into account. And so that's, in some ways, there may be other examples of that, I'm sure there are, but it's kind of an outstanding feature of Eritrean activities online. And I think it's interesting to think that these technologies were in no way created to serve the needs of African migrants or refugees, but there's this kind of synergy between the dispersal networks of diaspora and the networked connectivity of digital media. And Eritreans were very quick to recognize that and to use it to connect to each other and to connect back to Eritrea. So in 2005, a virtual national war memorial called the Martyrs Album, and this is where I'm going to run out of time because I have to keep digressing, I think. But Eritreans use the term martyrs for anyone who has died for the nation. It was first, that term was used by the Eritrean People's Liberation Front to talk about its fighters and others that were killed in the war. So this is a term that has deep resonance with, if you're talking about heritage and things like that. This is a very powerful term and in Eritrean culture at this point. So this website called awate.com established a virtual war memorial called the Martyrs Album that was devoted to those who had been killed in the 1998-2000 border war with Ethiopia. And it's interesting, I think it's a good example of how the internet facilitates political experimentation and makes possible the development of new kinds of objects and spaces and novel forms of political engagement that really have no offline counterpart. There's really no offline counterpart that's the same as, that works in the same way as an online memorial. And one of the interesting things about that memorial is that it involved cooperation between Eritreans in diaspora and government insiders in Eritrea who leaked government documents to the web managers. And it also involved, interestingly, technical assistance from one of the web managers of a rival Eritrean website, Asmara, which is another very important Eritrean diaspora political website. So it facilitated this, coordination among different Eritreans. And I should say, for people, not up on Eritrean politics, the regime of Isaias Afwerki is, extremely repressive. There's no free press. There's no parties allowed or civil society organizations, and they're highly secretive and controlling. And so one of the things that happened was that after the border war fighting ended in the year 2000, years had passed. 5 years had passed, and the government had not revealed how many people actually died and what were their names, who was actually killed. So, people may have known their relatives didn't come home, but you could hope that they fled and escaped over the border or something like that. So when Owate stepped in to create the Martyrs Album, they were really doing something very significant for all Eritreans. So they offered, in creating the Martyrs Album, they offered a virtual surrogate for what the state failed to provide its citizens. And in doing so, they did more than simply challenge the secrecy of the Isaias regime. The unauthorized but official-like action taken by the Owate team on behalf of the nation works to decenter state power from the seat of government in Asmara to Eritreans everywhere, revealing the inadequacy of the Eritrean state and foregrounding Eritrean people as the true essence of the nation. And I'll talk more about how this comes out through the way they constructed the Martyrs Album. It's comprised of 3 distinct components. The main one is the homepage of the memorial, which there was a link on Owate's homepage, and then that said Martyrs Album. You would click on that, and it would take you to a very different page than the normal pages of Owate, which are very lively and colorful and always updated with the latest current events and debates and things like that. If you clicked on the link to the Martyrs Album, instead you got this stark black page with some white type on it and images of burning candles. And there you can see, there's the formerly handsome, formerly heroic guerrilla fighter that's now a terrible dictator. But here you can see a fragment of from the Martyrs Album page. And I think particularly in contrast to the main pages of Owate, this page has a feeling of timelessness, and there is no space within the, I didn't say about the other two. The memorial homepage is like the first feature, and then there is a link to a statistical report, which I'll talk about, and to a facts page, which is kind of interesting because they talk about why they did it and what it means in some ways. So within the pages of the Martyrs Album, there's no means provided for posters to add content or comments. So there they've kind of suspended the interactivity of the internet. And they say in the facts page that they did this very consciously. And among other things, that lack of interactivity contributes to an aura of authoritativeness of this memorial. So the page it's a black page with images of burning candles and 2 slogans: eternal glory to our martyrs and liberty, security, and martyrdom, written in English, Arabic, and Tigrinya, which are the 3 languages that the government often uses, form the head and foot of the page. And in between them is a statement in English which reads in its entirety, quote, "This website is designed for many purposes. First and foremost, it is to pay tribute to the heroes who fell. Second, it is to humanize war and chronicle the cost of war, and in doing so, to prevent future wars. Heroes die for the sake of a cause, a country, but mostly they die to protect their comrades. This is a living monument to them." End quote. So it's important that this text performs a subtle yet significant departure from the Eritrean state's national narrative about martyrs when it claims that they mostly die to protect their comrades. This, along with other texts in the memorial, presents a vision of the nation that runs counter to the state's. Dying to protect their comrades constructs Eritrean nationalism not as a bond of people to their state, but as the bonds that tie Eritreans to one another. And this is a very powerful shift in the Eritrean context, which has been a highly centralized propagandizing, information-producing nationalist movement, and then that became the ruling party of the state. Within that memorial homepage, there are links to years that you can click on, and then that will tell you the list of the names who died that year, along with their rank, service assignment, year of birth, and age at death. In his influential book on nationalism, I'm already dropping down of my slides here, Benedict Anderson points to the map, the census, and the museum as quote, three institutions of power, key to the formation of national imaginaries. I would argue that a war memorial is also an institution of power, particularly for a nation like Eritrea, where national identity has been forged through warfare and martyrdom. Like museums, war memorials are partly concerned with representing the nation and narrating national history. Like the other institutions of power identified by Anderson, the map, the census, and the museum, a war memorial is very much about the kind of power I have called info-political. I developed this term, info-politics, kind of, complementing Foucault's notion of biopolitics, which is the power exercised through managing populations, to really think about, because people talk about information on the internet as if it's just sort of a freely existing kind of thing. And I felt like we need to constantly remind ourselves about the power exercised not through simply the content of information, but how information is curated, censored, authorized. So the ways in which information is managed, and those ways of managing information are being dramatically transformed by digital media. And so I think it's really interesting to try to think about that. So I see this memorial as info-political in a number of ways. One, it's an act of symbolic and communicative power rather than an act of seizing control over territory, material objects, or people. Also, because it makes public information that was leaked from government documents. It's an expose of state secrets and a critique of state practices of secrecy. The memorial is also info-political in the specific tactics of its composition. The way that the Awate team designed it, the symbols that they used, and the texts that they used involve using the state's own national symbols, practices, and official discourses, but recontextualizing them and reinterpreting them. So those elements give the memorial its recognizable national character and lend this unofficial construct a stately aura, but at the same time put a new twist on what Eritreans should understand the nation to be and what those symbols mean. The location of the memorial in cyberspace contributes to a distinctive representation of the nation, conducive to decentering it from the seat of authority in Asmara. Maps and museum buildings with their maps because of depicting boundaries and museum buildings, because of their specific locations, emphasize the territorial nation and foreground the division between everything and everyone internal to the nation and all that lies outside it. An online memorial obscures borders and distances. Given the dispersion and displacement Eritreans have experienced, it's significant that no matter where they were located, if they could access a computer, Eritreans could experience the memorial firsthand once it appeared online. So the virtual location is, in a sense, equidistant from everywhere and could be inside and outside of Eritrea at the same time. On the facts page, the Awate team state that the Vietnam Memorial in Washington, D.C. served as their model, and they even provide a link to its online counterpart. And there are clear aesthetic similarities between the Martyrs Album and the Vietnam Memorial, foregrounding the names of those who died in the war and emphasizing the human losses caused by war rather than celebrating victory or heroism. But of course, the Vietnam Memorial is an official memorial erected by the American government, whereas in the Eritrean case, the Martyrs Album is established online by Eritreans in diaspora using leaked government documents and taking an unofficial act. And the Vietnam Memorial, has a material existence on the ground, and so its online presence is more of an adjunct or a virtual replica, whereas the Martyrs Album is purely a digital construct. But to say that it exists only digitally does not in any way mean it did not have offline effects. In addition to generating discussion and controversy, the Martyrs Album led to further actions, including, for example, Eritrean volunteers. In 2005, Eritrean volunteers around the world read out the martyrs' names in a radio broadcast that was organized by the other website, asmarino.com. And it's interesting too, just as a contrast, on asmarino.com, they later got further information about all the people killed in the border war, and they created something called the Martyrs database. But it's totally different in character than the Martyrs Album, which is really constructed as a national war memorial. The Martyrs database is just simply, stark information. It is not framed at all in the same way. So while the creation of the memorial is an act of political protest against the Eritrean government, its design emulates state rhetoric and official forms, projecting an aura of authority and speaking in a national voice. And in that sense, they take some power away from the government by acting in a state-like manner on behalf of the public. How am I doing on time? I've completely...
Still 10 more minutes.
Okay, I better shift now. Let me tell one more thing about that before I shift to talk about Asmara. On the facts page, the Awate team explicitly addressed the question, is the internet really the right medium to publish such emotional and sensitive issue? And they answer, quote, "More important than the medium is the presentation. To those who doubt the ability of the internet to handle such a solemn issue, we invite you to visit the Vietnam Memorial website, which we used as our inspiration when designing the special page. By converting the data into an image file, we have taken some care to make it harder for malicious people to manipulate the information. Harder, but not impossible." So they're explaining that. Okay. Whoa, I have to say one more thing about the memorial. In a surprising development, so they had uploaded part of it at the end of 2004 and completed it in early 2005. But in 2008, so after 3 years, Awate reorganized its website and they moved the link from their homepage to their archives. And it's interesting, a lot of the websites that I studied initially maintained complete and accessible archives, which was like an incredible thing for a researcher to be able to do. But they have all changed that practice. And, very, very, very sadly, So for some time then, the memorial remained accessible in Awate's archives, but then they changed their practice of maintaining the complete archives, and at some point they deleted it. So I had checked in, there were some years went by when I wasn't checking it constantly, and I went looking for it in 2012, and I was able to find it as a screenshot that someone had saved somewhere. But just in preparing for this, I went looking for it again through Google searches, and I could only find it in the Wayback Machine. So, I mean, these, again, force us to think about the ambiguities of the spatialities and temporalities of cyberspace, that something that seemed so timeless and permanent and almost institution-like that we expect would be there can suddenly disappear, and other things that we think are just ephemeral and in a moment's passing actually end up having a long afterlife that we didn't expect. So there's a lot of ambiguities in that. But I should say that memorials can often be conceptual in nature. A memorial can be an activity, it can be a day, it can be a moment of silence. So it is maybe something special too about memorials. Okay, so the second part, example I wanted to talk about is how Eritreans represent their capital city online. And I think this raises some different questions because there's the dynamic among the physical existing city and the buildings and everything, and the images that are used to depict it and the text people post online about it and how they interpret the meaning of those. So here, the interactivity of the internet and the circulation of images is particularly important. Here's a post from somebody wrote on awate.com that says, "Does one fall in love merely with the brick and mortar buildings that make up a city? Do the other aspects matter more? The unique sounds and smells, the way people talk, wave, and smile, the taste of a special treat from the corner store, the way a taxi driver looks at you if you slam the passenger door too hard. These are some of the intangibles that make up the vibes of a place, the spirit of a city. And Asmara, the city we Eritreans idealize and romanticize so much, may have a thing or two to teach us, after all, about the value of capturing this metropolitan spirit and use to build a better nation." So as that quote suggests, I want to say something else. Asmara is often viewed by Europeans through the lens of an aesthetic nostalgia that casts the city as a time capsule of where exemplars of the architectural style of Italian fascism are preserved. And there are several books of photographs about the city of Asmara and its Italian fascist architecture. But as that quote above illustrates, the city represents something very different for Eritreans. And the poster quoted above, makes this distinction clear when he says that it's the spirit of the city that people love, quote, not the pseudo-superiority-inducing Italianesque features of the city, end quote. Defining and depicting Asmara is complex and contested among Eritreans. As the primal city of this small country, Asmara often stands in for the nation as a whole. In a predominantly rural society, Asmara represents the quintessential city, with its bars and nightlife and the tea shops and cafes where friends linger to chat. Here, people from all walks of life cross paths, not least among them the flaneurs and cosmopolites, proud of their urbanity. Asmara is also the capital city and the seat of government from which the Isaias regime exercises a highly centralized control over the country. Online, Eritreans are comparatively free to explore issues and voice perspectives that cannot safely be aired inside the country. So this is an important aspect of how they can contest the state's national narratives and also debate among each other about who they are and their city. And one of the ways that posters have begun to depict contemporary Eritrea is in terms of a clash of cultures, particularly the culture of the guerrilla movement that produced the regime as opposed to civilian culture, notably that of Asmara. And so posters contrast the easygoing, sophisticated, and life-loving Asmarino culture with the rigid culture of the fighters, who spent crucial decades in remote areas, missing out on formal education, youth culture, and participation in conventional forms of Eritrean sociality. Okay, I'm already needing to skip. Okay. And the particular flavor of Eritrean modernity is exemplified by the figure of the Asmarino, rather than by a collection of buildings or a beautiful palm-lined avenue. And I quote here a post from somebody who's talking about how everybody looked up to the Asmarino and wanted to be like them. One of the first politically critical websites called itself asmarino.com, a name that not only claims Eritreanness, but a certain inclusivity, because people from all over the country live in Asmara and so on. Another pro-government website critiqued that choice, saying they use the very name Asmarino to try to destroy what the good Asmarinos have established, creating this website to defame the government, and so on. And then there's a poster who talks about different parts of the city and associating them with family memories and teachers of his youth. And another poster comments on that, objecting to representing Asmara in terms of the city center and desirable neighborhoods rather than, quote, districts where the majority of Eritreans live, end quote. And he points out that in the colonial times, the nice parts of the city were reserved for the British and the Italians, and Eritreans couldn't even live there. All right, let's see. In addition to the text they post and pictures, there's some wonderful videos, and I wish I could show them to you, about Eritrea. And one is a video shot from a moving car coming from the outskirts of the city, maybe from the airport, going toward the center of the city, down the main Liberation or Harnett Avenue, and heading out to streets beyond it. And watching the video is first and foremost a feeling of motion. The camera's eye never lingers on anything or anyone, but conveys the dynamic sense of city life through motion itself. The buildings are mere background. The action is from pedestrians walking and crossing the street in random places, and from streams of cars moving in different directions, punctuated by colorful yellow taxis and big red buses. The beauty to be observed here, and it's titled A Nice Video Showing How Beautiful City is Asmara. The beauty is not the city's architecture, which is hardly visible, but the inviting sense of possibility that emerges from the movement, from the camera's freedom as it glides through the streets, and the hustle and bustle of people and traffic. You get the sense of the city as alive. This video stands in contrast to another video and another series of photos that focus on the decay and destruction of buildings in Asmara. And here are a few of those kinds of pictures. And one of them, one series of photos was put up by Asmarino's web managers, titled "Asmarino's Crumbling Buildings, Let the Pictures Speak." And these kinds of pictures are really sort of an autopsy of an urban corpse, showing you a city composed of wounds and scars. And they specifically in their text say that this is the fault of the regime, that they are letting this decline. And some of these, in some way, these buildings then are almost anthropomorphized, that they come to stand in for the deprivation and oppression experienced by the Eritrean people. So representations of Asmara online are revealing what's at stake in different ways of representing the city, and how cyberspace offers a terrain for exploring, contesting, and constructing Eritrea's past, present, and futures. But there was one other part that I skipped that I want to go back to, and that will be the last thing, because I think that's important, and that is, where they're talking about how the culture of the government contrasts with sort of the vibrancy of the culture of Asmara and how the government's destroying it. One poster writes, quote, "The culture of Asmara is hijacked by those street thugs of Isaias Afewerki for now, but they cannot take it away from us because it is inside of us," end quote. And I think that way of thinking about the spirit and culture of Asmara is interesting. I mean, Asmara itself, in a sense, becomes a virtual city. It allows people to transcend the city itself. And so the regime may physically control Asmara, its capital city, but the ideals of civic life and citizenship that the city symbolizes cannot be captured and contained, and each of the posters in their own way lays some claim to the city by representing it on their own terms. So I will stop there.